Welcome to our companion podcast on important family business matters, Family Business Briefs, with our AI hosts, Jen and Ted. The content in these episodes comes directly from Family Enterprise USA and can be found at familyenterpriseusa.com. As we all know, many issues like taxes, economic policies, and new legislation affecting family businesses are complex. So, with the assistance of AI and our AI hosts, Jen and Ted, this technology helps make sense of it all in a brief, clear, and lively discussion, and all in about 10 minutes. We hope you find the information presented here useful and entertaining. Now, let's listen in on this episode's important family business topic.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another Deep Dive.
Yeah, hey everyone.
Today, we are going to do a deep dive on something that I think affects pretty much everybody in the U.S.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, who doesn't love talking about taxes, right?
Right.
Especially when they could be changing.
Exactly, and that's exactly what we're going to look at today. We're going to be looking at potential upcoming tax and economic policy changes from a pretty interesting perspective.
Yeah, and this is a perspective that you don't always get to see. We hear a lot about, both sides of the aisle and what they say publicly, but what about what they say when they think no one's listening?
Yeah, and so that's kind of what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some excerpts from an article that was in a publication focused on family businesses.
Right.
And it features insights from two people, Karen Street and Mark Warren.
Okay, yeah, I've heard those names.
Yeah, and they are Capitol Hill insiders, right? So they've been around the block. They know how this stuff works. And what I think is really interesting is one is a Democrat and one is a Republican. Okay, so we're going to get, sort of both sides of the story.
Exactly.
Which I think is really important. Yeah, so we're going to try to take a look at and see what they're saying, in this article about potential upcoming changes, and we can kind of get a sense of where things might be headed.
Right, and hopefully get a sense of, how much of what they're saying is genuine and how much of it is just political maneuvering.
Right, exactly.
Which, let's be honest, is a big part of it.
Of course, of course. So one of the things that both of them actually agree on is that we are really early in the legislative process.
Right. I mean, it's only February.
Exactly. And, things can change so rapidly, especially in an election year like this year.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is when things get really unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen. Someone could, sneeze the wrong way and suddenly the whole agenda gets flipped on its head.
Totally, totally. And this is probably why both Karen Street and Mark Warren said that, kind of the immediate hurdle that needs to be jumped over is funding the government in March.
Right. I mean, that's kind of a big one. If you don't fund the government, everything shuts down.
Yeah.
Not good.
Not good at all.
And, they both seem to agree that, this is going to require a lot of cooperation between the parties, which we don't always see a ton of these days.
Right.
And it's really interesting because this first hurdle could really set the tone for the rest of the year. If they can't even agree on this basic thing, how are they going to get anything else done?
Exactly. And that's a great point. I mean, how much are they willing to compromise? How much are they willing to work together?
Right.
If they can't get past this, then, we're in for a pretty rocky ride, I think.
Yeah, and it's not just about, passing laws. It's about, the whole atmosphere in Washington. If they're constantly fighting and bickering, that just creates this toxic environment where nothing gets done.
Right, and that trickles down to, us.
Exactly.
The voters, the people, and, the economy. I mean, it affects everything.
It really does. And, I think what's interesting is that this article really highlights how these political decisions, they're not just happening in a vacuum. They have real-world consequences for people.
Yeah,
And I think that's something that we often forget. We get so caught up in the horse race aspect of politics, who's up, who's down.
Right.
But we forget that these decisions actually affect our lives.
Exactly. So let's talk about some of the specific things that they talked about in this article.
Okay.
One of the things they talked about was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed a few years ago.
Right, back in 2017, I think it was. Yeah, big tax overhaul.
Yeah, huge tax overhaul. And some of those tax cuts are actually set to expire in a few years. So they were talking about the potential for extending those tax cuts. That is where we start to see a little bit of a partisan divide.
Right, yeah. Karen Street, from the Democratic perspective, she really emphasized the cost of extending these tax cuts.
Yeah.
Her argument that, it could add trillions of dollars to the deficit, which is already a big concern for her party.
Right, and that's something that we hear a lot from the Democrats. They're very concerned about the deficit. And Understandably so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate concern. We can't just keep spending money that we don't have.
Right.
But then you have Mark Warren on the other side. He's a Republican, and he suggests that there might be some room for compromise.
Interesting.
Particularly if they tweak certain provisions to benefit specific industries.
Okay, so he's saying there's a way to do it, but it has to be done in a very specific way.
Exactly. It's not just a blanket extension. They have to really look at the details and see, what makes sense economically, what's going to stimulate growth without, blowing up the deficit.
Right. And it's so interesting because this is where you start to see the sausage get made.
It really is.
This is the nitty-gritty of politics.
Yeah, and this is where, the lobbyists come in and they start, whispering in people's ears and, trying to get their little piece of the pie.
Totally. And so, when we talk about, these extensions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what are some of the political risks for lawmakers on both sides when they come to, making a decision?
Well, the article really highlighted one big one. No politician, regardless of party, wants to face voters in 2026 having raised taxes.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I mean, imagine you're a politician, you go back to your district and you say, hey, guess what? I voted to raise your taxes.
Yeah, not a good
Not a winning strategy.
No, not at all.
So that's a huge concern for both Democrats and Republicans.
Right. But do you think it's fair to say that all politicians only care about getting reelected? Or do you think that some of them actually genuinely believe in certain tax policies?
Oh, I definitely think there's a spectrum. You have some politicians who are purely in it for themselves. They just want the power and the percentage.
Right.
But then you have others who genuinely believe in certain policies and they're willing to fight for them, even if it means risking their reelection.
Yeah.
And, those are the kind of politicians I think we need more of.
I agree. I think it's important to have people who are, principled and who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, even when it's tough.
Exactly.
But it can be really hard to tell, who's who sometimes.
It really can. I mean, everyone says the right things on the campaign trail. They all promise to fight for the little guy and, lower taxes and all that.
Right.
But then once they get into office, it's a different story.
It's all about compromise and backroom deals and all that.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to really pay attention to what politicians do, not just what they say.
Right.
Look at their voting record, look at their donors, look at who they're aligned with.
That's such a good point. Look at the actions, not just the words.
Exactly.
Okay, so in an article, they talk about specific priorities that are being advocated for by Family Enterprise USA, which is a group that represents family businesses.
Okay. Yeah, they're a pretty influential group. They represent a lot of businesses across the country.
They do. And what's really interesting is they're not just saying like, oh, we want lower taxes. They're actually coming to the table with very specific policy proposals.
Okay, so they've done their homework.
They have. They really have. And I think that's what makes them so effective.
Yeah, it's one thing to just complain about taxes. It's another thing to actually come up with solutions.
Exactly. So let's talk about some of these key things that they're pushing for. One of the things that they talk about is income tax rates.
Right. They want to make sure that the tax rates for businesses are competitive so that they can, grow and create jobs.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? I mean, if businesses are taxed too heavily, they're not going to be able to invest and expand.
Exactly. And then, the whole economy suffers.
Right, so that's one of their big priorities. In other words, the estate tax.
Okay, yeah, the death tax, as some people call it.
Yeah.
This is a big one for family businesses, because they're often passing down their businesses to their children or grandchildren.
Right, and so the estate tax can make it really difficult to do that.
Exactly. You could have a family business that's been around for generations, and then suddenly the government comes in and takes a huge chunk of it when the owner dies.
Yeah, and that can really force families to sell their businesses or break them up.
Right, and that's not good for anyone. It hurts the family, it hurts the employees, it hurts the local community.
Right, so Family Enterprise USA, they're really advocating for changes to the estate tax to make it easier for family businesses to pass down their businesses to the next generation.
Yeah, they want to make sure that these businesses can stay in the family and continue to thrive.
Okay, so income tax rates, estate tax, what else is on their list?
Well, another big one is capital gains taxes.
Okay.
When you sell an asset like a stock or a piece of real estate, you have to pay taxes on the profit you make.
Right, capital gains.
Exactly. And for family businesses, this can be a big issue when they sell their business or pass it down to the next generation.
Okay, so they're looking at ways to potentially lower the capital gains tax or make it easier for family businesses to manage that tax burden.
Exactly. They want to make sure that it's not so onerous that it discourages people from starting or growing businesses.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so we've got income tax rates, estate tax, capital gains tax, anything else?
Well, they're also focused on how pass-through entities are taxed.
Okay, now this is where it gets a little bit complicated for me. Can you explain what a pass-through entity is?
Sure. So a pass-through entity is basically a business structure where the profits and losses of the business are passed through to the owner's personal income taxes.
Okay, so instead of the business itself being taxed, the income is taxed on the individual's returns.
Exactly. So the business itself doesn't pay corporate income tax.
Okay,
And this is a really common structure for small businesses and family businesses.
I see.
Think of sole proprietorships, partnerships, S corporations.
Got it.
These are all examples of pass-through entities.
Okay, and so what are they advocating for in terms of how these pass-through entities are taxed?
Well, they want to make sure that the tax code is fair and that it doesn't create an undue burden on these businesses.
Okay,
They want to make sure that the tax rates are reasonable and that the rules are clear and easy to follow.
that makes sense. I mean, no one wants to deal with a complicated tax code.
Exactly. And, the more complicated the tax code is, the more likely it is that people are going to make mistakes or try to find loopholes.
Right, and then you end up with all sorts of problems.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like Family Enterprise USA has a pretty comprehensive list of priorities.
They do, and what's really interesting is that the article hints that Congress is actually listening to them.
Really?
Yeah, they have a seat at the table. They're being consulted on these issues.
Okay, so does that mean we might actually see some of these priorities reflected in actual legislation?
It's certainly possible. The fact that they're being listened to is a good sign.
Yeah.
It means that lawmakers are taking their concerns seriously.
Okay, well, that's good news, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of stuff today.
We have government funding political maneuvering hacks proposals. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it really is. So what does all this mean for our listeners? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that these potential policy shifts could impact everyone, not just family businesses.
Right.
These tax policies, they affect the entire economy. They affect how much money people have in their pockets. They affect how businesses operate.
So really, we should all be paying attention to this stuff.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and the more you know about these issues, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions.
Okay, so as you're listening to this, think about which of these priorities that we talked about resonates most with you and why.
Yeah, think about how these policies could impact your life, your family, your business.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment or send us an email.
Yeah, we're always interested in hearing from our listeners.
All right, well, that's it for our deep dive today.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Family Business Briefs with Jen and Ted brings Family Enterprise USA's and Policy and Taxation Group's original insights to life using new AI technology for a more engaging experience. While core information remains true to the source, some nuances may vary. We hope you enjoy this innovative approach and join us for the next episode. If you like this podcast, please subscribe by hitting subscribe.